Okay. Okay, well, welcome everybody. It's a delight to have you all here for lunch with me and for Biostat seminar. So my seminar is entitled Biostatistics, Climate Change and Health, a very small topic. And I have on the background here, there's a really lovely sort of collection of climate change related art. You're welcome to go to this URL if you're curious about it. This is one of the images there that I thought was very interesting. Okay, and so actually this is another image from that same art archive. And it was this talk that I'm giving today is one that I originally prepared to give at Columbia back in October during happier times at Columbia. And so you can see that it's a nice image of New York City envisioning a green future there. So I thought I would keep that in solidarity with everything going on. So today I'm going to be talking about sort of three major topics. The first one is just generally thinking. Paul, could you mute yourself? It sounds like you're having some lovely chips. So I'm going to talk about the background of thinking about biostatistics and climate change and health, especially thinking about the long track record that our division has in environmental statistics and how we can take some of the lessons we've learned there and think about applying it to climate change as another key environmental exposure. And then I'm going to talk about two different projects, one a more methodological project, the second one a more applied project. So that's the basic setup for today. So this is sort of a recent path of my directions in research. So basically, if you knew me maybe 10 years ago or so, I was very interested in exhaled nitric oxide as a biomarker of breath, airway inflammation that can be assessed non-invasively. I was very interested in hierarchical Bayesian models for linking a deterministic model of how the lung functions, like the dynamics in the lung, and paired that with stochastically observed data. I was working with sort of more sensor data, wearable sensor data as part of PRISMs. And then I took a sabbatical that was now probably 3 or 4 years ago, and I really decided to change my research direction. I got really interested in climate change and health. And so, as an academic, we have this freedom to sort of redefine ourselves every few years. Perhaps this is a moment of another redefinition of ourselves at right now, but we'll see. But this is what I felt 3 or 4 years ago. There was, this one article that I read in The Guardian, where the headline was just, there's no point in anything else. And that was really impactful to me and thinking about what to do. And I really enjoyed my time on sabbatical. And I read all sorts of books about climate change, both fiction, nonfiction, and thinking about directions to go in research. Okay, and so it's hard to think about getting involved in a new discipline, a new area of application for statistics. And so as I came to realize, climate change itself is a very well-established field. It started with some of the first papers recognizing the greenhouse effect were one from Eunice Foote. If you don't know about her, she's also worth a Google to find out about her. But she published back in 1856 on this idea of the greenhouse effect. And then, it's also just a very vast and multidisciplinary field. I chose this kind of famous picture here of the idea of an elephant. All these different experts come in and try to tell you what an elephant is. I feel like it's the same thing with climate change and health. You can't tackle these problems without having experts in all the different disciplines that are needed. So that makes it also very hard to challenge, like as a statistician on your own. And so I thought about how can I get involved? How can I start to go down this research path? And you probably are also familiar with the famous quote from John Tukey about the best thing about being a statistician is that you get to play in everyone's backyard. I really think, I love being a statistician, a biostatistician. And so what I did then is I said, basically, whenever there was an opportunity to do anything related to climate change and health, I said yes. So that was a very good time to approach me about anything related to that. And I thought back to Duncan Thomas, and he had this one saying where if you want to learn something new, write a grant on it or teach a class on it. And so I said, I don't know that I'm ready to write a grant yet. So I decided to teach a class. And so I got together on the next slide, actually, I'll talk about it some more, but we founded a new class on this topic. And then I also spent some time reflecting on sort of the similarities, dissimilarities with fields that I had experience with, like environmental statistics. And so I'll talk about that. And then I've been working to identify what some key methodological questions are to help drive the field forward. And so, as I mentioned, one of the ways to get involved in the field and learn about this was to teach a class on it. And so I joined up with Erica Garcia and Sam Silva, who was in earth sciences, and we developed a course together. We applied for the provost, had funding for, or no, it wasn't the provost. I think it was the sustainability and the curriculum initiatives. So we were able to get some course development funds. And so we had this lofty goal if we wanted to develop a course to provide the framework and tools to empower the next generation of data scientists to improve the future of human health in a changing climate. So it's, again, a very small goal. And so we taught it twice as a special topics course. Jaime actually helped us develop some of the lab materials when we developed it into a lab. And actually just last week, we got approved as a formal course number. So now it's a formally cross-listed course. We'll be offering it next year in the spring. So it's 619 in PM and GL cross-listed across the two departments. I'm very excited about that, to have that institutional support to really move forward in this topic. And so now I'm going to transition to the part thinking about what can we learn from the science we've done in the past to think about, especially biostatistical approaches to climate change and health. And so I stumbled across this really lovely visualization about the success stories that we've had in air pollution epi. So this is, are you guys familiar with the idea of climate stripes, kind of thinking about temperature being visualized with sort of, colors from red to blue? This team decided to visualize air pollution levels using the climate stripe idea. So what you can see here, and you can see their website here, what they did is they took historical information to look at a couple different use cases around the world. I think actually they have many different places, but you can see here how blue is very good all the way up to the dark red, extremely poor. You can see how in a place like London, some of you may be familiar with the Great Smog, and I think it was 1952, where there was really, really extreme air pollution as London industrialized. And it's a great success story now. We've done so much work to control air pollution sources and set regulations to really protect human health that we've seen dramatic decreases in air pollution. So it's really a great success story. In LA, you can kind of put it in perspective. We certainly have had a period of terrible air pollution from the 1920s to the 2000s, but we're getting better. It's really a great success story. New York City, the same thing. It was particularly bad from 1900 to 1930-ish or so. In Beijing, more recent success story here. You can see the levels were incredibly high in the 2000s and have been going down. You can think about the Beijing Olympics as being this real moment when people were able to really think about controlling air pollution, seeing the impacts of that and what an impact that has had. Okay, and so this got me thinking more generally about how have we had these great successes with air pollution? And I had an opportunity in the fall to actually serve as a subject matter expert for the EPA on their integrated science assessment for the oxides of nitrogen, sort of this document they put together summarizing all the evidence about oxides of nitrogen and how they impact human health. And so it really helped me put things in perspective and thinking about the policy goals for air pollution. The stated goal is to protect health, including vulnerable subpopulations, and that this is achieved by setting ambient air quality standards or controlling air pollution at the source, such as the tailpipe or industrial sources or power plants as well. And so in order to enact those kinds of policies, what information do we need to be producing in epi studies? I did not really appreciate how important it is to produce sort of actionable data until I served on this sort of committee for the EPA. And so here's what I saw is, air pollution regulators, at least at the time, they were trying to gather very strong evidence and they were moving relatively slowly to sort of improve and update the science, what we knew about the science. And what they're really looking for was consistent evidence of associations between air pollution exposure and relevant health outcomes. They were very interested in the shape of the concentration response or exposure response curve. If you're looking at a continuous exposure or any sort of outcome, it's really important to look at that potential nonlinearity of association. They were really looking for that in every paper, and not all the papers were doing that. So that's something very easy that we can do. They were interested in especially the vulnerable populations, identifying at-risk life stages and populations, and also really understanding methodological challenges or biases or impacts of exposure error when they're assigning exposures to folks, and looking at the impacts of confounding and how that could make the inference that we're making less reliable. And so the types of common epidemiological study designs that are used to provide this evidence, you probably have heard of these, of course, panel studies, case crossover studies, time series studies, case control, cohort, cross-sectional, and quasi-experimental. Ideally, we'd be setting up studies where we're looking at prior exposure and relating that to subsequent health outcomes. And so then I started to really link this to climate change and health. How does this transport over to climate change and health? Do you notice how, like here, where we've made really great success with air pollution, we can regulate air pollution. We see that air pollution impacts health and we can regulate it. We can stop air pollution. But what's really interesting to think about climate and health, we're thinking that, the weather has big health impacts, big heat events or wildfires, they have real clear health impacts, but we can't regulate the weather. We can't say, don't be higher than 95 degrees, like that doesn't work. And so the scientific questions of interest are not these main effects kind of question of exposure to health. That's not really it's important to document, but it's not where the action's going to be. So I think it's going to be really impactful to think about scientific questions that are more like about adaptation. Can we adapt by setting standards, for example, for workplace temperatures, increasing access to air conditioning or designing our homes or workplaces to be cooler or working hours, increasing green space, things like that. So an example research question like Jaime is working on is does access to air conditioning reduce the impact of extreme temperatures on mortality? And if you think about that, that is inherently an effect modification kind of question. So we're setting ourselves up for a little bit of a trickier problem. We're going to need larger sample sizes. The rule of thumb is you need about 4 times the sample size to answer effect modification kinds of questions. And then I realized that there was another feature that made this even trickier, and this is that extreme weather, by definition, right now, doesn't happen all the time. It's relatively rare. And so we're also setting ourselves up for a harder problem. Here's the little schematic of if here's the prevalence of your exposure, here's your minimum detectable effect size. As your prevalence goes down, the minimum detectable effect size gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So I think that many of the questions that are going to be really impactful for climate change and health are going to be about effect modification and with rare exposure. So these are we don't have much information to figure this out. So I think we really need to think about smart study designs. I don't have any answers yet, but this is one of the directions that I've been going and trying to identify what's an area that we need to work on methodologically, because it's a hard problem. We're trying to think about efficient study designs that really can capture these extreme exposures in an effect modification setting kind of way. And then, it's of course of interest to understand at-risk life stages or populations at higher risk. And again, that could be an effect modification or a stratification question. If you work in the idea of adaptation, is it like a three-way interaction? So that gets to be even more complicated. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for interesting contributions here. But I think it's inherently a different problem than air pollution. Environmental statistics has been with air pollution. And then another feature that I think really plays into this is that controlling, fossil fuel-based emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, it will improve climate and health, but it happens on a really long time scale. And it's hard, we know right now, it's really hard to make changes that impact things on a really long time scale. And so how can we help motivate people to make changes on a shorter time scale? Because we need to urgently make changes quickly. One way that we can think about this is that carbon dioxide emissions are related to combustion processes that can often produce air pollution, things that we know well how to study, and they do impact health on a short term. So I think one direction that we can go in is thinking about the short-term co-benefits of climate change mitigation measures, and that could hopefully help drive policy and help provide evidence for what the most effective policies are that can improve our health right now, and then they'll have the benefit of improving our health in the future. And then just the urgency of this is just so strong, even more so today. Another thing that I thought about is that when we're looking at air pollution and health, usually the exposure response curves relating air pollution and health, they're monotone, non-decreasing. I was remembering back to this really lovely article back in 2009 by Arden Pope et al., looking at the relative risk of and I can't remember if it was mortality or some sort of cardiovascular disease sort of outcome, but in relation to all sorts of levels of PM exposure, particulate matter exposure. They gathered evidence from air pollution studies, and they also gathered evidence from smoking related exposures. And so they were able to show this sort of very strong dose response relationship. On the x-axis here, this is on the log scale. So you can see just that there's a very strong dose response relationship. If you were to plot it on the original scale, it would look more curved, but it's typically monotone, non-decreasing. This is different than a climate-related hazard like temperature. Actually, the association that we often see is more U-shaped. And here's a really lovely article by Antonio Gasparini from 2015, looking at the temperature mortality, I think, associations in many different locations across the world. And you can really see that clear U-shape in some locations. You can see, for example, here in London, a really strong increased risk of mortality, relative risk here at high temperatures and also at low temperatures. In places like Sweden, if you can make this out here, you can see an increased risk at high temperatures, but it's relatively, doesn't really go up that much in the cold temperatures. Perhaps the population is pretty well adapted to really cold temperatures. So I think this is another important feature to think about, is that this non-monotonicity of that exposure response relationship. And then, then I guess another thing that I wanted to mention here is, if we're looking at heat, for example, something that we're interested in, we really want to understand what's going on this tail. And as I was just mentioning, these really extreme exposures don't happen that often right now. But if we think about it, they're going to be happening more and more. And so this is a really lovely graphic in the New York Times a couple of years ago. This is the distribution of daily mean summer temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere, where if you keep an eye on this part of the tail of the distribution, this is kind of related to that talk we had a couple of weeks ago by Karen McKinnon. So you can see that extremely hot, if we define it as 3 standard deviations above the mean from 1950 to 1980. Here is what it looks like right now. And then as we move forward in the decades, you can see how there's more extremely hot days as we move on. And so we can see that as we get closer to our current time period, we see many more of these extremely hot days. So it's important to be able to characterize what happens at that extreme tail, even though we have relatively limited data now, because it's going to be increasingly important in the future. Okay, so that was just some motivations to get you thinking about things. And so I have sort of 2, concrete projects now that we'll talk about related to these 2 themes. So the first one is a methods paper that I worked on with Caleb Shimke, a PIBS PhD student. And this came out of a pilot project from the Southern California Environmental Health Sciences Center, where I was PI and co-Is were Erica and Sam. And so we were looking at the efficiency of case crossover versus time series designs for extreme heat exposures. And so the motivation for this was a paper that was a really highly impactful paper that Erica led with George Van Weiss. And the paper was on the effects of co-exposure to extremes of heat and particulate air pollution on mortality in California. And so here's the basic idea of this paper. They were interested in relating daily co-exposure to extreme heat and ambient fine PM to daily all-cause mortality counts in California over a 5 or 6 year period. And so they were using a method that's very popular called time-stratified case crossover. I think I'll define that in a couple slides. And they were using recent co-exposures to extreme heat and PM 2.5 on each case day and comparing that to control days. So you'll notice that I mentioned the theme of extreme heat and extreme PM related to that idea that I was mentioning earlier, that it's hard to detect effects of really rare exposures. And they're also using a case crossover design. And so here's how they divined the extreme exposure. So they would look, they looked at, this is sort of a administrative records sort of cohort study, where they would look at the, I guess more of a time series studies looking at the having each death available by the date of death. And they had information on the residence census tract. So then they would look on the day that a person died, They would look at exposures that were defined as extreme based on the minimum temperature of that day. Think about like at night, how warm was it at night? And then there was dichotomization of this continuous variable. Was it, if it was above the 90th percentile, the 95th, the 97th, or the 99th percentile? And one thing that I think is interesting to think about is that we do have some adaptation to heat. And so the definition of the percentiles for heat were local, like how extreme was it for this town or for this census tract. And then for the PM, the extreme PM, that was a global definition of percentiles because we don't have evidence that people adapt to air pollution. Air pollution is bad for you if you're here or in China or wherever you are. Air pollution is bad for you. We don't really adapt to that. Okay, so we had these two dichotomized exposures that were of interest, and especially the extremes were of interest, these very rare exposures, and they're co-exposure. So we're even making the problem a little bit harder because we're interested in looking at them together when you have really high heat and really high PM. This is often in the case where you have wildfire exposures. That's the kind of situation where you have not like recently, but more summertime or fall kind of wildfire situation. And so this was really one of their main results figures. And so I'll orient you to this. For example, if you look at this first panel, you can see that there are different rows based on the dichotomization of extreme temperature, the minimum temperature. So these results are for the days that had extreme minimum temperature. And so when you dichotomize at the 90th percentile, you see that at lag 0, so the minimum temperature today, how does that impact your risk of mortality? And so you can see a little bit more evidence at more proximal times rather than lag 3. And as we go to more and more extreme temperatures, you start to see more and more of a signal there at the lag 0, and then kind of declining over time as you lag. When they looked at the extreme PM 2.5 only days, we also saw some evidence, especially at the really extreme exposures. And this was really the punchline, the really interesting and novel contribution, especially with this paper, was showing that when you have days that were extreme in both the temperature and the PM, the effect sizes were much larger. You do notice how those confidence intervals get bigger, though. And so then I started to contemplate, what does it mean to be dichotomizing temperature? Like you have this like these are all kind of time series type studies. What does it mean to be dichotomizing temperature? And this is a data set from a well-known sort of tutorial paper on how to do time series studies. And so we took a look at it in this data set that was provided with this. And so focus here on this right-hand panel for a second. And if you imagine defining temperature at the 99th percentile in this data set, this is a time series from London, you can notice how that extreme temperature happens, like in this summer, it happened only on one day, that red dot. And then there was actually a period of quite elevated temperature. Do you notice this time period here? It's 2003. Does anybody remember what was going on in Europe in the summer of 2003? Basically, this is what was going on. There was a really big heat wave that really woke everybody up to the dangers of extreme heat. Like thousands and thousands of people died, and it really, it brought on some air conditioning in places like Paris that never had it and things like that. It was really extreme, and it really woke everybody up to the dangers of extreme heat. A lot of elderly people died. And you could see, though, so there were many days in that summertime of 2003, but then there was just, one day in 2004, one day in 2005, and then several days in the 2006 summer. But I think it's important to think about when we dichotomize at such an extreme, it's so episodic, it just happens once that whole summer. And what does that mean in terms of our study designs and the analyses we're doing? And I think it's interesting to look here. This is the time series of daily deaths. And you can see what I was talking about. You can see that huge spike in deaths that happened in the summer of 2003 and in London. So I said, okay, this is what it looks like in London to dichotomize at the 99th percentile with time series data. How does it look in California? So Dr. Erica Garcia shared some of the time series data on minimum temperature and daily deaths, and Caleb made this beautiful plot. So we can see if we dichotomize at the 99th percentile, this was for LA County, sort of generically. LA County is very big, so I acknowledge that's a little maybe challenging to conceptualize of. But just to think about it, if we dichotomize at the 99th percentile, 2016 had no super hot days, whereas you can see other years had, maybe one period of extreme heat or maybe a couple different heat waves that happened. So you can kind of visualize what that looks like. And then, the mortality signal associated with those heat events is not nearly as obvious as it was with that London data.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
On the last slide, you also use daily minimum temperature.
This is a publicly available data set, and I think it might have been 24-hour average temperature. I'm not exactly sure.
That makes sense. Yeah. I was just going margin switch to minimum.
This is because that was what the paper was using, that we were trying to explore the methodology for a little bit more.
Yeah, I would just go with the average temperature.
But actually, sort of more biologically, one of the reasons people are looking at minimum temperature is that it's becoming understood that you need some time to, like, maybe you can handle a little bit of heat, but your body really needs that nighttime period to recover. And if you don't, especially in like urban heat island situations, it really doesn't cool down as much, and they're seeing stronger effects of nighttime heat than necessarily daytime heat.
Okay.
But that's sort of the scientific motivation for it, rather than the very practical motivation that I wanted to replicate the paper closely.
Okay, so it's more than potential. Was it taken in one location or all over this?
So this example is like an average of these census tract values, but the census tract values were obtained from I think it was the WRF model. So it's basically a model of temperatures based on some readings and then some sort of atmospheric chemistry modeling kind of things.
Okay.
Okay, and so while I was on sabbatical, I was trying to do some reading about methods, and I came across this paper which sort of piqued my interest in thinking about these issues. So there was this paper in 1999 by Bateson and Schwartz talking about comparing different methods for time series data, like I was just talking about. What they did is they were comparing time series models like you would do with a Poisson regression, I'll define in a moment. And they were comparing this to case crossover designs like Dr. Garcia et al. Used in that study. And what they noticed, and I hadn't really appreciated, is that they said that actually the case crossover designs had worse efficiency. Think about larger variance of the estimator as compared to Poisson time series. And I had never really heard about that. And so I said, oh, maybe that's something to think about. And then I was thinking about another paper that I came across where they raised the issue of, if you're thinking about a case crossover design, they are often, this little, my presentation is out of order because I haven't quite defined the case crossover design yet, but case crossover designs are often estimated using a conditional logistic regression model. And that's really problematic if you have a rare binary exposure, because some of the observations will contribute nothing. If you have this matched sort of stratum of values and all the exposure is 0 for all of them, all that information contributes nothing to the estimator. So that's really problematic. And nobody had really explored this carefully and thought about these issues. And especially, all these researchers are dichotomizing the exposure. They have this rare exposure. What are the implications here? I was really worried about, do we have really uncertain estimates, really variable estimates using these kinds of methodologies? Okay, and so here now I'm going to define these things. When I was in grad school, actually, I worked a lot with time series analysis for air pollution and mortality using quasi-Poisson regression. The basic idea of these models is you want to relate day-to-day variation in the outcome, which are counts of mortality, at a given location, to day-to-day variation in exposure, like 24-hour average PM, or in our case, temperature. And you really want to control for time varying confounders. That's the really crucial thing in these models, because there are patterns that vary over time. If you're looking at mortality, more people tend to die in the winter time when there's things like flu or now COVID. So you need to control for these long-term or seasonal trends. So you can imagine fitting a model like a quasi-Poisson model, where you're modeling the log of the expected number of counts in location C, day T, as a function of your time varying exposure, daily exposure, possibly lagged a couple days, controlling for a smooth function of time. And this is really the crucial thing of how do you control for time or other time varying factors. And then you maybe relax the assumption that the mean equals the variance in the quasi-Poisson kind of way. And so some advantages of this are each location serves as its own control. There's no need to control for time constant confounders. And then the disadvantage is that it's sort of an ecological analysis looking at some sort of geographic unit. But it has some advantages in that you're like doing the same sort of modeling for multiple locations. You can combine across locations using like a meta regression kind of approach or something like that. Okay, and then this is in contrast to the time-stratified case crossover design, which has really exploded in popularity in the last decade or so. And the idea here is this is a case-only study design. So you think about a person who has died, you think about that as the case, and you are able to control for time variant and time invariant factors by the sampling design. And you're really making within subject comparisons of exposure. So basically you have what's called an index day here with this black triangle. So imagine that this is the day on which somebody died. Let's say it was maybe the second Monday in January. And basically you then look at the exposure at that same location on all the other Mondays in January. And that's sort of your stratum that you look at. You compare like, was the temperature really high on the day that that person died, or maybe the day before that person died, and you compare it to the temperatures the day before on all the other Mondays in January. And so these are the stratum that I was talking about. And when you have a binary exposure that's very rare, you might very often have all of these values be 0 for all the exposures in the stratum. And usually people fit these models using conditional logistic regression, where you have these nuisance parameters for each of the stratum. There's a more sort of computationally efficient way that people often use now using conditional Poisson regression. Here's that reference if you're curious. Okay, and so basically what we did in this pilot study is we wanted to do a formal evaluation using simulation methods to compare a time series approach to the case crossover approach and see what we lost in efficiency, under the two, what happens when the exposure becomes very extreme, very rare. And so we would compare the time series to the time stratified case crossover design by making this exposure increasingly rare. We use the LA County data to generate we use real temperature data to generate our mortality data, our simulated mortality data. We assumed a constant beta for the continuous or binary exposure. We also tried varying the beta, but for simplicity, I'll just show this one. We did a number of simulated data sets, and then we would either fit the Poisson model or the time stratified case crossover. And so here's the takeaway results. I'll orient you. So we generated data under 2 different data generating mechanisms, because obviously when you fit a model, how the data was generated, that model is going to look better. So here we are generating the data using time series model approaches. And what you can see here on the y-axis is the relative efficiency. And you'll notice that the model that was used to generate the data is this black diamond, the time series with 8 degrees of freedom. You can see that one is sort of our reference here for the relative efficiency. And the case crossover design had poor efficiency. So it had larger variance in the estimator. And you can see that as this was when it was a continuous exposure, and then we dichotomized increasingly extreme. So that relative efficiency got worse and worse for the case crossover design. We then tried to check and said, well, that wasn't fair because we were generating the data under a time series kind of approach, the Poisson time series. So we said, let's generate it under a case crossover kind of assumption. But we actually saw the exact same pattern, that the case crossover was less efficient as it got to be a more rare exposure. But you'll see that the relative efficiency was kind of topping out. We only looked at the 99th percentile, but it was about 80% relative efficient. If you remember all the way back to that Bateson and Schwartz, they saw about a 60%, 66% relative efficiency. And they were actually using an older version of case crossover where they had only one reference before and after, rather than looking at all the Mondays in January, for example. So that it's a little bit better to be using the more modern version of case crossover time stratified approaches nowadays. We fit these models to the real data in LA County, and we saw smaller standard errors. Here you can see the relative efficiency with the real data. So we observed it with the real data as well. So the takeaway really is that in the simulation study and in the real data analysis, the case crossover estimates had smaller magnitude and larger standard errors than the time series. And so this is sort of just to wrap this up, because I'm looking at the time. Caleb got to present on this at ISEE in 2024. And some of you may recognize this person here, who is Joel Schwartz. So it was really nice that Caleb got to share his work to the person who inspired this line of work with that Joel Schwartz paper from 1999. So it was kind of fun to close that loop there. And so a takeaway is that we need to be aware that if we're fitting the case crossover kind of model, it has these appealing features in that it's an individual, like a case only design rather than being ecological, but we have reduced efficiency. And this becomes even worse when we have really rare exposures. So I don't have a solution yet to this problem, but at least we've identified the problem. And it comes down to the fact that if you have a strata with no variation in exposure, if they're all non-hot, super hot days, they provide no information in the conditional logistic regression. So if we think about our time-stratified case crossover using 6 years of data in LA County, there were only 90 strata that had variation in extreme heat when you had the 99th percentile cutoff. So we're really throwing away a ton of data in this kind of modeling approach. It's just really important to remember that how you control for time really matters. Either approach can be biased depending on the assumptions you make about the trends in time and how well you are able to recover what is the true trends in time. Another thing that we haven't investigated yet, but I think is an important thing to think about, is that there's an assumption in case crossover called the transient exposure assumption. And this is violated when you have heat waves. It's very common that we see, if you see an extremely hot day today, tomorrow might be extremely hot as well. And we're increasingly seeing heat waves spanning more than 1 week. And so that will really violate, the exposure 1 week later, in this case, crossover design won't be independent. And so we haven't investigated that yet, but that's another issue. But the initial work here we've published in environmental epidemiology just a month or two ago, or I guess it's April, so in the future. So that was great. And now I'm going to switch over to my other topic, which is more applied, looking at the co-benefits of electrifying transportation. And so this is part of the EVAC study. It stands for Electric Vehicle Adoption in California. That is an R01 led by Erica Garcia, and you can see the team here. I'll be talking about reductions in satellite-based measures of NO2 air pollution associated with zero emissions vehicle adoption in California. And I do have, now that I'm talking about cars, I have a conflict of interest to disclose to you. So Erica Garcia, who's the PI, she has some personal sort of retirement investments in Tesla and Rivian. They're all outside the submitted work. And actually my husband works in emissions testing for a major automobile manufacturer. And so we go through the disclose system, and we have a conflict of interest that is managed by the USC Health Science Campus Conflict of Interest Review Committee. And this includes independent review of data collection and analyses, and all the other study investigators have no conflicts. Okay, so setting the scene for this work. So electrification of the transportation sector. This is really an important climate change mitigation strategy. Mitigation is kind of, reducing climate change in the future. In the long term, if we stop burning fossil fuels in cars or transportation, trucks and trains and all these things, we'll be reducing greenhouse gas emissions to reduce future climate change. That's sort of one of the ultimate goals. But it has this feature of having the shorter term impact of co-benefits for public health. And you'll notice that I put sort of in italics here projected co-benefits because much of the data that we have today is just based on projections. So here's the idea underlying this, is that tailpipe related combustion is a major source of air pollution, things like fine particulate matter and nitrogen dioxide. I bolded nitrogen dioxide here because this is the lowest hanging fruit. Because if you think about fine PM, if you think about a car operating, particulate matter can come both from the tailpipe, from combustion, but also can come from tire wear, road dust, brake wear. So it's a little bit more complicated with PM. So we started looking at NO2 because that comes just from the combustion processes, just from the tailpipe. And then it's well known that traffic-related air pollution, or TRAP, has a range of adverse health outcomes like respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, and premature mortality. And so, as I was mentioning, much of the evidence that's out there on the health co-benefits of the transition to electric vehicles are projections. And so here's a nice example of this. There was a report in 2023 from the American Lung Association that did some calculations, some hypothetical scenarios, and estimated that if we had 100% transition to zero emission passenger vehicle sales and non-combustion clean energy by 2035, the cumulative benefits within the US over like a 20-year period, I think it was from 2030 to 2050, would be, 978 billion in public health benefits, nearly 90,000 fewer premature deaths, and you can see, 2.2 million fewer asthma attacks and so on. So we can project that there's a lot of benefits to this transition. But these are projections rather than real world data. And sometimes real world data can be a little bit more, or can help confirm and inspire people to make decisions, related to policy. And then we were also thinking about where we are here in California. And, we really do lead the electric vehicle adoption, at least within the US. In California, the state is getting a little bit old now, but you can see in 2022 of all the EVs by state, California had 40% of them across all the US. So that's really quite a few. And you can see that the transition really started in the early 2010s. And if I was to extend this out, it's continued to go up quite dramatically. So we're in a period of dramatic change in our transportation, in our personal vehicles. And so we conducted a pilot study that was used to get the R01. And basically what we did is we were trying to take real world, all publicly available data and see, could we see the public health co-benefit of the early phase transition to electric vehicles? We basically took this idea that within zip codes in California, we're seeing increasing numbers of electric vehicles registered. Could we link those increasing numbers of EVs to improvements in health? We looked at asthma ED visits and changes in air pollution. Could we actually see impacts of, that there weren't that many electric vehicles on the road then, but could we see impacts? We actually found quite strong evidence for the asthma ED visits, but I'm going to focus on the NO2 signal. And so these are the results from that. We saw, this is an unadjusted association here. We saw some evidence that as we were in locations with a larger 7-year change in zero emission vehicles, we did see a trend towards lower air pollution, NO2 air pollution, a bigger change downward in air pollution, but it wasn't statistically significant. You can see my confidence intervals here. My p-value was 0.25 in an adjusted model, but there were some real limitations to the study design that we were using. We were using EPA monitors, but there's, even though California has one of the densest monitoring networks for EPA for NO2, it's still, not as wide as you might wish. There were only about 95 locations with EPA monitors during the study period for NO2. And there's another issue is that the EPA monitoring site locations, they're not random. They are cited for regulatory purposes, either because they're close to maybe a source of air pollution or in an area that tends to have air pollution, or maybe it's an area with a lot of people. There's all these different decisions that go into citing an EPA monitor, so it's not fully representative. And this paper we published, you're welcome to take a look at it. And it was a really high impact paper, and we got to have a lot of fun interactions with the media and other folks related to it. So we realized that there was really a limitation, and that was, using the EPA monitors, the monitoring network was relatively sparse. You can see here's a map of where these EPA monitor locations were in about 2019. So you can see the various levels at these locations, and it's, there's a lot of areas of California that we're missing. And so we had the idea to switch to using satellite data because there was this TROMPI instrument on a satellite that became available in mid-2018. I have it on the next slide, but you can see just when we use a satellite to measure NO2, we can just have, incredible spatial coverage. And you can see just the dramatic improvement in coverage that we have with that data. And so we brought on to our team new collaborators, Sam Silva, who you heard me mention before, and also Dan Goldberg, who actually created the data set that we're using here. And so here's more information about the TROMPI satellite. So the TROMPI instrument is on the Sentinel-5 satellite. It was launched in mid-2018. And the idea is that from space, they're measuring the column of NO2 from low Earth orbit. And so what this means is that once a day at about 1:30 p.m. local time, you get a snapshot of what the NO2 was like in the tropospheric column. And so especially in more urban polluted areas, this represents near surface NO2 and NOx. And so the data that was provided by Dan Goldberg and his team as part of the HACAS group at NASA, he's at George Washington, was a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid of annual average NO2 over a 5-year time period from 2019 to 2023. And it's made freely available. Anyone can go and download it. You have to make an account with NASA, but you can log in and download it. And so we took these data and we averaged them to California ZICTAs, which I'll mention in a second. It's kind of similar to the idea of zip codes. And I just wanted to emphasize that in all this work, we're really focusing on measured air pollutants rather than, there's colleagues out there who are doing beautiful models of air pollution, sort of exposure surfaces, but we really want to focus on measurements because these are pretty subtle changes in the traffic fleet, the fleet of cars, and we didn't want to get into sort of a circular argument that like the source goes into the model for air pollution, then we're trying to, so it seemed we just want to be focusing on measurements to start with. And so in doing this work, the initial pilot study, I was doing it and I was sort of naive to spatial methods and just I did linkages just with zip code because that's how the data was produced. But we've gotten more sophisticated and now we're using these things called ZICTAs or zip code tabulation areas. And Fu-Tu Chen, a postdoc working with Erica, recently published this paper thinking about what the downsides are if we just use zip codes as they come, because so many agencies are now producing publicly available data, but they might try to coarsen it to zip code because they have the address and it's easy to just report only the zip code field. But there can be some downsides to this. Zip codes that were designed for delivering the mail. They were not designed for longitudinal analysis. They change dramatically year to year. In some places, it's surprising to me because my zip code stays the same. But you can think about this building, how we changed address. We didn't change zip code, but we changed address very dramatically all of a sudden. So there can be changes like that to zip codes as well. And so there's this thing called a crosswalk linkage, which is a much better approach. So if you're ever dealing with zip code data, look up this paper by Fu-Tu that will point you to some great resources. But what she was able to do was to show that if you don't use crosswalk linkage and you just take the zip codes that are available, we differentially exclude more disadvantaged populations. So that can be problematic. Okay, so back to the analysis that I'm talking about. So basically we were thinking about the satellite NO2 data. And so here I've made some spaghetti plots of the annual averages at the ZICTA level. And you can see that there's been some declines over the study period. And I wanted to contrast this just with the ground level EPA monitor data. And so you can see in the gray box here, this is the same time period as we have for the satellite data. And you can see over that longer time period, there's been declines in NO2 as well. These are just EPA monitors in California and the satellite data over California ZICTAs. You can see that the correlation between the satellite measurements and the EPA monitor measurements is about 0.85, the Spearman's correlation, so pretty good agreement in California. And so now I'm going to mention the data resources that we're using. It's completely publicly available. We are looking at measured annual average NO2 from that NASA data portal for the TROMPI satellite, EPA monitor values from the EPA Air Now data. At this time range, we're looking at 123 stations over about a 12-year period for the EPA data. And then the data we get on electric vehicles is from a partnership between the California Energy Commission and the California DMV. And every April, they release a new version of the data set that has the count by zip code of all types of vehicle registration. So basically by fuel type, you can look up, by hydrogen cars or electric vehicles, fully battery electric, or all these different kinds. What we've done is we've summed them into two different types of vehicles. We have zero emission vehicles, which is sort of a regulatory definition. So that includes battery electric and plug-in hybrid, which are not really fully electric because you can use some gasoline, and also hydrogen fuel cell, which is very small during this time period. And then we also are going to be looking at so-called ICE vehicles. These are the traditional internal combustion engine vehicles. So we're going to be looking at both of these to kind of, this is for
regular hybrids. Plug-in hybrids.
I think that probably would be an ICE vehicle, like kind of, yeah. Good question. I should double check. Yeah. And then we get information on population characteristics from the American Community Survey as part of the census, especially thinking about how we control for socioeconomic status and telecommuting patterns as well, which I'll bring up in a second. So here's sort of a spatial visualization of this EV data, CEV data. And you can see in 2019, these are again the ZICTA level counts of ZEVs. And you can see how there's been an increase from 2019 to 2023. And you can see kind of where the locations are. The analysis that we're going to be performing here, though, is really focused on a within location change because there can be all sorts of spatial confounding going on.
That's the number, not percentage.
That's the number, correct.
Okay, did you ever look at the percentage?
So I have looked at the percent, and there are some places, I forget, I think there's some places that are as high as maybe 17 or 20% by 2023. But there's a lot of noise because we're trying to be as inclusive as possible as all the ZICTAs, and there's some very small population ZICTAs.
Okay,
But yeah, but
even on a larger scale, I would sort of like to see that.
yeah.
Okay, we can't do it on this. County wide, see,
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm wondering if I have it here in, you can maybe do some kind of back of the envelope calculations here. So here's the almost 1,700 ZICTAs that we're looking at in California. So I have some summary statistics in 2019 and 2023. And so you can see the median number of zero emission vehicles in these ZICTA was 137 in 2019, 423 in 2023. And you can see the total number of vehicles here on median. So you can maybe do some back of the envelope calculations. You can see the population sizes and so on. I wanted to note that, think about the study period that we're looking at. It includes the pandemic. So this is a trickier analysis than our initial one. So we gathered information about like the percent work from home. You can see that increased quite a bit on median, so on. I was interested, I think about California as a place that has a lot of cars, but I was looking up the statistics, and actually California has about 0.8 vehicles per capita. So it's actually has, it's number 41 out of 50 states. And since I did this presentation originally in New York, comparing that to New York, which you think would have relatively few cars, it's 0.47, that's 49 out of 50. But the state that has the most cars per person is Montana. Does anybody know why that is? I think that Montana has some very lax regulations, maybe about taxes or sales tax or something. They do, but it's some funny tax or income law or something.
I mean, I'm not sure.
I think a lot of, I recommend you to Google, like my memory is that I think sometimes people with very fancy cars will register them in Montana. I think you can like register them even though you don't live there and avoid some sort of tax situation or fees. So I think that's why there's so many.
Amtrak buses, because Amtrak has buses, they're all registered in Wyoming. Just because cheaper taxes.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm low on time, so I'm just going to skim through. So you can see the longitudinal trends by ZICTA. Again, we're increasing, but this time period, we're a little bit further into like the mid-phase transition to zero emission vehicles. We're going to be doing a positive control analysis for internal combustion engine vehicles, which you can see is much more stable over time. Here's some unadjusted associations between zero emission vehicles and annual satellite NO2, similar to that other plot I showed you. We see stronger evidence for a negative association unadjusted. When we're looking at internal combustion engine vehicles, we see a positive association like you would expect. And then we think about, this is a very tricky time period to be studying because it does include the pandemic. So Erica is an expert in causal analysis. So we sat down and thought through a DAG about what were the really important variables to confound or to adjust for, confounders to adjust for, sort of at this within location kind of analysis. And so we came up with that we needed to additionally adjust for gas prices and telecommuting patterns. So we went and gathered data. I'd already mentioned telecommuting, but we found a resource for gas prices as well. And so we fit these linear mixed effects models with ZICTA level. Paul has people register cars in Montana to avoid high sales taxes and emissions inspections. There we go. So I'm going to skip over the modeling, but we're basically just fitting a mixed effects model with ZICTA level random effects. So here's my model. I'll just highlight that we're using the natural log of NO2 as the outcome. The natural log is playing two roles for us here. It helps us better satisfy our modeling assumptions. And it also helps us because these units for the satellite NO2 are like these very large values. And so I find it a little bit easier for our interpretation. So we'll be talking about percent differences in NO2. We're being really careful to group mean center our number of zero emission vehicles because it varies dramatically across locations. We really want to target the within location association, and we're scaling to a 200 ZEV change or an 800 internal combustion vehicle change. So here's our results. Basically, we find under a variety of different models about a 1% decrease in NO2 for every 200 zero emission vehicle increase within a ZICTA. In the positive control analysis, the results were a little bit more sensitive to the various models we fit, but we see, an association in the positive direction, like you would expect: more internal combustion engine vehicles, more NO2 air pollution. We had the positive control analysis. We had a ground truth analysis where we looked at the EPA monitor NO2, and now that we have a longer time period, we see now negative associations that are statistically significant using the EPA data as well. And since we have a longer time period, I played around with some more aggressive adjustment for time, and we still see that association. So in summary, we're using real world data on the air quality co-benefit of the ZEV transition. Now we're looking at the mid-phase transition to ZEVs in California. We find robust evidence for an association. There is limited temporal availability. And we really tried to make this analysis as rigorous as possible by having the ground truth and the positive control elements. And so we're really trying to quantify the observed environmental health co-benefits of this climate change mitigation measure. And I'm really excited because I think this methodology can be extended to study other climate change mitigation efforts. And there are some strengths and limitations. I'm going to skip over these for the sake of time, but just thinking about future opportunities, we did this case study in California. It's satellite data that we're using to assess NO2, so we could look globally. And we could really use this kind of approach for sort of rapid first order evaluations of the air quality co-benefits, so changes that are going on. It's in general, it's an exciting time to study natural experiments because so many changes are happening. You can think about, there's a big transition to electric motorbikes happening in certain countries, and there's transitions to more active transport as well. We have the LA Olympics as another natural experiment opportunity. And I wanted to end on this quote from Rick Cold, LA's chief deputy controller, saying the future should be electric. The future of cars should be electric, but the future should not be about cars. And I just love this picture here of people biking and the train. And if you know me, you know that I'm an avid public transit user. And so I take the train every day to work. And then I also bike a lot. And here's a picture of me with my son on our electric cargo bike. And I'll just stop there. So my final thought. This was a really inspiring quote to me when I was getting interested in climate change and health. This is from the 2015 Lancet Commission, that climate change is the greatest global health threat facing the world in the 21st century, but it is also the greatest opportunity to redefine social and environmental determinants of health. And I think we as biostatisticians can contribute. It's going to be a hard couple of years. We'll figure it out. But thank you very much. Okay. So we have 1 minute, but thank you all for your attention. Yes.
Okay, people are buying electric vehicles. I'm assuming those are probably fuel electric vehicles.
Yeah.
Okay, as opposed to buying a new ICE car.
Yes.
Is the pollution requirements for the ICE cars lowering the amount of NO2?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So,
yes.
Yeah, I just wonder. You're saying this is the cars were bought, but both cars have one has 0 and the other one has reduced. Is that being taken into account?
So I do include a temporal trend for year. So I'm adjusting. I think that goes into that adjustment for time over time, that trend of time. But yeah, I think that's a great point. And we're actually working on some sort of pilot study analyses, thinking about what's going on at the port. And I actually just this morning I was trying to quantify as the trucks have newer engine years, we can actually see that the NO2 is going down as the truck fleet gets newer and newer. And I mean, that's what, a lot of the regulations have been about, the amount of emissions coming out of the tailpipe, and those definitely have an impact. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
You mentioned briefly the choice to focus on NO2 rather than particulate matter. Is that something that's gotten better in recent years? I mean, it's definitely also a concern, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So the health evidence for PM 2.5 is really, really strong. And so that's definitely of interest, but it just is a little bit more complicated. In Erica's R1, we're going to be looking at PM 2.5, but because it is produced by brake wear and tire wear, and actually on electric vehicles, they're heavier than their internal combustion counterparts because of all the batteries. So I've heard that electric vehicles go through tires faster sometimes, and so there might be more tire wear, but then there's regenerative braking, so then there's maybe less brake wear, and so it's complicated, I guess, is the short answer, but we're going to be looking into that too. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandy.